on the constitutional rights, the right to life, the right to strike, the right to organize. And this sends shockwaves through society. So, the first impact is inside the tripartite alliance. Deep divisions started to emerge over the Marikana massacre and its implications. NUMSA started reflecting very critically on the alliance and on the relation with the ANC. And the United Front eventually emerges out of that. And the EFF is formed. And it's the place where it's launched, Economic Freedom Front, is in Marikana. And that's where it's got a very strong base, and it emerges out of those social fractures. Going over to bargained corporatism, to this arrangement between big business, big labor, and big government. These fractures within the tripartite alliance and within the labor movement have a big impact over there. No longer can you talk about big labor. The NUM collapses on the Platinum Belt. AMCU emerges as a big union, as a dynamic union, a powerful union beyond COSATU. NUMSA is expelled from COSATU. A new metalworkers union is being launched within COSATU. So you're starting to see the fragmentation of labor and no longer the possibility, undermining the foundations of bargained corporatism. This little arrow points to the white-owned economy. I think these new forces, the United Front and the economic freedom fighters, are pointing to the legacy of apartheid and the continued inequality in the ownership of productive assets in our society. And then there are the community protests, which are essentially, many of them and a growing number, often attended by both state violence as well as community violence. And these are a response to, or at least a cry for notice from an unresponsive democracy. So in that way, in that sense, they're an indication of a democracy that is not functioning, that is unresponsive. And then land grabs. This comes under the traditional chiefs area, where, and you'll hear a lot about this later, Gavin and Sonobile will be talking about this, where an alliance of the chiefs and mining capital is dispossessing villages of their land and leading to greater stratification and new conflicts within the rural areas. And then linked to the informal political system, the unofficial political system is intra-ANC violence, taking the form of violence in constitutional meetings, for example, as well as assassinations within the ANC. So in all of these ways, you can see these institutional pillars that support democratization beginning to fray at the edges, beginning to erode and fracture. And then finally, underlying all of this is an environmental devastation, which again, in many ways, appears to be invisible. In fact, Jackie's term for it is invisible violence, the slow violence of environmental devastation, which has very far-reaching effects and a kind of devastating consequences for our future, which may not be apparent now, but will become more apparent over the years. So these are all areas of fracture and contestation and crisis that our work involves. And the term that I've started using to understand this is the term violent democracy. Now the idea of violent democracy actually comes from a comment that Michael made at the Precarious Society colloquium we had 4 years ago, I think, and where he was commenting on papers from different countries in the world and commenting on the fact that there was a lot of violence in democracies in the global south, and that perhaps these could be characterized as violent democracies. So I took this up and worked on it, and I think that violent democracy has some of these characteristics here, where democratic processes become occasions for violence. And violence and democracy are mutually shaping. Democracy itself becomes what Guillermo O'Donnell calls low-intensity democracy, where all the institutions are there, people vote, but the actual access to power and to justice is quite reduced. Now I'm going to move to the second part of my paper, and as I predicted, I don't have much time left, but I'll summarize it as I go. But this is really looking at taking a more reflective approach, and I want to actually come back to Tawana's comment on slow sociology. Yes, I do hope that future historians of SWAP will see Eddie's period, which is a long period, as the period of the windmill, and mine as the period of slow sociology. Observers, SWAP's observers, now Eddie being one of them now, and Michael and Dunbar, have all drawn attention to the apparent continuity of the windmill effect. And I must say that a lot of the time I do feel that I'm being whirled around like a windmill. But I'm trying to slow it down. And the point is this, that our work, and some of the work that Eddie's described historically, we have really, I think, been at the cutting edge of work and of the development of new understandings globally. But too often, because of the pressures of our times, because of these difficult and fast-moving realities that we're grappling with, because of the demands of the audiences that we engage with and our collaborators in civil society, we move on. We move on to the next project. And what happens occasionally is that our work then gets noticed by social scientists in the North and taken up and woven into grand narratives about South Africa that are drafted elsewhere. And we are not the authors in that sense. We are not the authors of our own histories. And we are not the authors of our own theoretical work. And the argument around slow sociology is, can we slow this down? Can we spend more time with our own work in order to do the theoretical work, the conceptual work, that is actually paradigm shifting and that can have a global impact? And that's the aspiration. So what I'm going to draw, what I'm going to sort of very briefly point to now is the question of the making and unmaking of theory in the South. And I want to argue that these dramatic processes of social orders emerging and coming apart and fragmenting and being reformed, reconfigured, re-emerging, and very old hierarchies persisting, new hierarchies emerging, that this gives us an opportunity to work theoretically to try and understand this. And that involves the making and unmaking of some of the theoretical, some of the theories that we inherit from our colleagues in other societies and in the North. And in particular here, so the kind of question that I'm engaging with here is the question of Pierre Bourdieu, the great French sociologist who's had an incredible influence on sociology around the world. And I'm going to raise the question of Bourdieu in the fields of violent democracy. What is Bourdieu, who spent, of course, he started his work in Algeria under colonialism, which was certainly violent, and then turned his eye back to French society. What happens to his work in these fields of violent democracy? And I'm going to, so who is Bourdieu? So I really need to elaborate a bit more on Bourdieu's own theory. Some of you will be familiar with it, others won't. And I don't have the time to go into that. But really what I want to say is that Bourdieu is about the analysis of order, social order, and how it reproduces itself. And the incredible kind of depth and stability of social order and the difficulty of developing resistance and alternatives. And so, just to be very sort of schematic about it, we have the world, we have the social fields, which is the social structures of the world beyond the individual, beyond the subject. And that is internalized in the habitus. It's internalized in each subject as a way of engaging with the world. And this habitus allows the social agent to engage in the world, to be an actor in the world, but it constrains the agent. So the agency that human subjects have operates within the limits of the structural constraints of which they are the product. Now with that theory, with that conceptual formation, how do you start talking about change? How is it possible for agents to change social structure? And that is what I'm going to try and point to here. So, this slide is really, and I'm going to read from it, it's too small for most of you to read, I'm going to read excerpts. But essentially, this is about that unofficial political system that I described. So we have in South Africa the constitutional political system, the democratic political system, and we have this unofficial system. Now these quotes come from a trade union leader, a national leader, very closely involved in the struggle, very much linked into the ANC. And this was I asked him, we were talking about corruption, and these were his comments. He said, it's about the kind of lifestyle they live, the cars they drive, and including what we drink when we are socializing. When you ask, but comrades, why are we doing things like this? They say, you live in the past. And when it comes to tenders, the first thing they want to know is how much they are going to get from the tender. When you ask them, how can you do such a thing? They ask you, what's wrong with you? This is how things are done. They really laugh their lungs out when you ask them about these things. It's the issue about our value system. And now listen to this one. So our cadres look for one of us who seems to be doing better, and they follow on their footsteps, and those become dominant values which overshadow the old values. And he ends by saying, I'm afraid, comrade, I'm very afraid. Now what I find remarkable about this is that it's such a Bourdieusian description. Bourdieu talks about how values and one's understanding of the world is physical, is embodied, operates below the level of consciousness. Now, this guy says, so our cadres follow on their footsteps. What could be more embodied than that? Follow on their footsteps, and those become dominant values. He's describing a process of I suppose, of emergence of a new habitus. Now, the question really for Bourdieu here, and that goes to the next slide, is he doesn't have space for contradictory values and practices and ways of doing things. How do you put together this way of doing things and the constitutional and democratic way of doing things? And individuals, officials, government officials, members of the elite, many people in our society are doing both of these things. So we have to talk about clashing fields, warring habitus, an incoherent symbolic system, the constitutional system that someone will stand up and pay tribute to, and then the informal system that people operate by. A law that is destabilized by a counter law. And I want to argue that this in some ways renders Bourdieu incoherent. Now I'm not going to go into the other studies that I've done that sort of suggest the same kind of thing, except possibly here. Let me just see what we're doing, how we're doing on time. Just for a couple of seconds. This is at the other end of the social spectrum. This is in an informal settlement with RDP houses mixed up amongst informal settlement. And it's about crime, and it's about the law, and it's about a patroller for the Community Police Forum, a woman. And she says, her words up on the top left, I would like to put a big no, the law doesn't exist. The law doesn't work for us. As long as you have money, you can live the way you want in this country of ours. The criminal who's in jail, who's been actually put in jail by the patrollers, they apprehended this criminal for rape, and he's now sitting in waiting trial. He sends a message back and he says, tell that girl and her group that I will be out very soon and I will deal with her. And then she describes the vigilantes in the community, and she says, she sees herself as upholding the law. But she says the community does not care as long as he is dead. A criminal is a criminal. You steal other people's things, you deserve to die. They do not give a damn. Now I'm trying to point here to the way law is partial, it's provisional. It doesn't have a great purchase in such communities. It doesn't have a great presence. One of the reasons being that she tells us, the police are corrupt, they're drunk, they don't come. When they do come, they can be bribed, they'll let the guy out. So we have to take the law into our own hands. That's where vigilantism emerges. And the police won't protect me from the criminals, she says. So you have a very, very difficult kind of a sense that the law is distant, that we want to uphold the law, that we must abide by the law, that we must break the law, that there's a different law, the law of vigilantism, which says that the only good criminal is a dead criminal, and then of course the law of the criminals themselves. This is a cauldron. Now the CPF Petrolo, who I was really struck by, very powerful speaker, and she says, I uphold the law. I'm a very brave lady, I know I am. 5 years later, when we returned to this place, what's happened is that she's in Sanko in the executive, and she gets charged with selling an RDP plot to someone. She's become part of a nexus of this unofficial passing out of things. So the question is, what does the law mean in South Africa? Now, for Bourdieu, the law is really that through which the state organizes the society and inculcates a stable vision, a legitimate vision of what the society is about. It can't work here. So I'm arguing that Bourdieu is destabilized once again by our reality. Not to go into details there, but to end. So I'm talking about the making and unmaking, the unmaking and remaking of theory from the North. And the question that faces us is, do we reject Bourdieu's theory, and I'm taking him as a proxy for many, many theorists from the North, do we reject it as irredeemably Western, or do we attempt to reconstruct Bourdieu through interaction with Southern reality? That's the big question that I'm trying to work with. So to bring that to a close, this is really to demonstrate that democratization is a destabilizing force. And it not only destabilizes our society, it destabilizes old powers, old authorities, old hierarchies, leads to new hierarchies, new powers, new struggles, and new forms of violence. All of this is unsettled. It also destabilizes us as theorists, as social scientists, in our attempts to try and understand things. So I'll end there.
Okay, thanks very much, Carl. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have like two very rich presentations. I wish we had another hour just divided into engagement with the two, but we don't. But Carl said I could take another 10 minutes on the commentary, Q&A and discuss it. So let's get going. Razi.
Thanks. Thank you for bringing us into light about the research that SWOP did at a time when we were far from entering the university. I only entered the university in 1995. But there's something that piques my curiosity. In the research that you highlighted, I'm left with the question, how do white people work? It seems that all the studies that you've given us about how black people work, has SWOP been interested in how white people work? Because, of course, one does not need to be a structuralist to realize that how black people work is overdetermined by how white people work.
Okay, I'll take 3 at a time. Yes. Please bring the mic.
Yeah, just a simple one on Carl's presentation. In the bourgeoisization scheme or theory, making or remaking of it, where is a sense of freedom in all that? Where 20 years later, where is a sense of freedom among workers and those? It's whether we are a free society, which I think all of us desires.
Yes. Cool.
Thanks. Quest for Carl. When you spoke about the 5 pillars to advance the transition from apartheid to democracy, you spoke about BEE. What's your view 21 years later on the success of BEE in achieving equality? Thanks.
Let me just respond to the first questioner, Lawazi, Mashaba, is it? I've chosen 4 case studies. My own, there are quite a lot of studies that do deal with management, which tends to be white. I mean, part of the issue is that white people are not workers generally in South Africa. That's part of the answer. But in my main work, which is Caste and Racial Mould, I look at half the book is on white workers, but white workers who are craftsmen, skilled workers, and I look at it historically, how they lost their skill, and many become supervisors and so on. And I turn in the second half of the book to black workers. So in that sense, I look at it, white workers historically.
Yeah. The question of freedom and theory. I mean, I think that I want to go back to that to Adam's comment about we're going into quite a rough world, and I think it comes hard for us to acknowledge that the democratic rights and the democratic breakthroughs that we've won in South Africa through so many struggles are actually in many ways quite limited and are not being realized in so many parts of our country. So then the question arises, well, how can we change this? How can we make our society more democratic? How can we make it responsive to the plight of the poor? And I think that's a complex and big question, and it's got to do partly with the breakdowns that I pointed to in my presentation, and the new forces that are emerging, and perhaps the ways in which we'll work with both new and old forces. But also, I think at the level of theory, I mean, I really think that my own grappling with Bourdieu is about what is the space of agency, which another way of saying that is what is the space of freedom, and are there ways in which we can recast Bourdieu? So what I was unable the slide that I was unable to elaborate on, when you look at Bourdieu's own work, the poor, the working class, I mean, there's not such a huge unemployed poor in France, but workers and the poor do not have symbolic resources of their own. They are dominated through the symbolic power that the dominant classes have in society. Now, I think what's abundantly clear in South Africa is the symbolic resources that the poor have. And just to use one example, the protests that I talked about, and as SWAPO, we've done quite a lot of work on the protests. When people burn tires and put up barricades and burn down the house of the councillor or the local hall, so we asked them, well, what's this about? Why burn down these things? And people say, in the one case they said the premier. Okay, so the authorities, the premier, they'll see by the smoke we're calling them. Now this suggests that burning things down is a kind of symbolic force, a symbolic power that the poor have to call attention to their plight. And it's absolutely clear, when things start burning, the authorities come, the ANC comes, there's a crisis, something is done. And people say, well, because of the violence, the water is now clean. But there's a lot of perverse ways that this works as well. So we asked people in protests about xenophobic attacks that took place in the middle of protests. And they say, well, foreigners are valued very highly by the press, by the media, by government, by everyone. And if you attack a foreigner, they'll come. Then we'll get attention. So that's one way of calling attention to ourselves. So this thing works in very difficult and complicated ways, as Adam said, a rough and dangerous and difficult world. But what are the sources of agency within it? That's what we have to discover and uncover. Coming to the question about BEE, I mean, I think that it's quite clear that BE's had a very limited effect. We've got some new big, black business moguls, mostly junior partners in white-owned companies, mostly also locked in by very heavy levels of debt, and therefore not, if you like, very much lacking a freedom, lacking an agency because of the way they're locked into existing corporations and activities and locked in by debt. And the question is, it seems to me, the question is, what kind of mechanism can be developed for the emergence of an autonomous black business class? And what kind of redistribution of productive assets is required to do that?
Take another round. Yes. Please bring the mic for
my question is following on specifically Carl's work on violent democracy and now the excellent overview that you've given us about the breaking down of systems that hold the country together going into the transition. We haven't completely fallen apart yet, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the things that have been recreated that aren't harmful. So not violence, not institutions that are run by corruption and political patronage. What is it that's keeping us from a complete revolution and destruction?
Yes, right at the back.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Maria from Kenya College. Thanks very much for the colloquium. I think it's very interesting. I want to just pick up on the points that I think Professor Webster made. I think, Comrade Eddie, you become very modest in terms of your role, and I think the role of SWAP, I think particularly in the development of the trade union movement and democracy in this country, because I think what for me was absolutely great was Eddie Webster, the insurgent sociologist, because I think you placed people, you developed a cadre, and that was absolutely important at that point in time because of what we needed, what the liberation movement needed, what the workers' movement in this country needed. And I think you also placed that cadre. You intervened in influencing them, orientating them, and I think it was a whole generation. A generation, a lot of them were white students, but I think they played such an important role in the trade union movement. I think for me, the problem I have, Carl, is your slow sociology, especially now at this point in time, when we need insurgent sociologists, when there's so much happening in terms of transformation from the right, but especially from the left, and in terms of assisting and supporting that movement. Because I think that, I suppose it also goes to our perspective in terms of how knowledge is created. Because it isn't created at the universities. It's created with people, with masses of people in struggle. So I think this is the time for the insurgent sociologists to actually be out there and to be assisting. At this point in time, I think we are seeing a revitalization. We are seeing people exercising their social agency all over the country. So I think for me this is a big challenge. And I would agree with Adam that it does require a lot of intellectual and political work.
Yes.
My name is Fabio. I'm from the University of São Paulo, Brazil. I've been in South Africa just for a few days, but I would like to deep upon on the question that was made by the colleague just behind me about what keeps South Africa together. Because in these few days that I've been here, it is drawn to my attention that there's what I would call an ideology around Mandela and the African National Congress So I'd like to hear your comments since Carl has talked so much about the symbolic dimension of politics. I'd like to hear your comment on that and what's the role that it plays in bringing like national unity.
So this card you should start by what you edit. Do you want to go first or no?
Look, thank you, Maria. It's not often that I'm described as modest. I really appreciate that. It's something I'm going to remember. I think that a very crucial part of the 30 years of SWAP was building a new generation, and I think that that has been and is an ongoing part of the SWAP project, and I think it's maybe people live beyond books and ideas, and maybe that is the most valuable contribution. But I just wanted to pick up on your comments about the current and future. I think contained in my presentation was in some ways a call to return to the public sociology, and that policy sociology, which involves working for government or business or whatever, has quite serious limitations, and the work when we have done it has been very disappointing. Maybe it's a comment about the limits of sociology as a way of influencing policy, and certainly the kind of sociology. But if there's a SWAP tradition, I think it's an ethnographic, qualitative tradition, and I think in some ways I think we are in an interesting moment where a new student movement is emerging, which the WITS politics department like to believe, the students believe it started here, not at UCT, but it's very much around the question that's being raised here about order, the nature of our society, and I think that's going to spread, and it's going to issues about race, people like Fanon, and those kinds of issues that are coming to forward. And what I was suggesting in my conclusion is that we've seen the emergence of a new order. We've seen the decline of that, and I'm suggesting, and it's clearly also what Carl is pointing towards, the beginnings of an alternative emerging, and for that reason I think it is. I'm not sure if Adam's right, it's going to be more complex than the past, but as I always say, that sociologists are better at predicting the past than the future. Thanks.
What keeps things together? Well, two comments, two questions. A very important question that I didn't dwell and perhaps enough on, but I think that a critical factor that keeps things together is the ANC, actually. remains the ANC. And it's partly, I suppose, its ideological reach. It's not. I mean, to talk about it as an ideology is maybe a bit misleading. I mean, it's the history of the liberation struggle over the last 40, 50 years. The kind of the dominance of the symbols of the ANC in the liberation struggle. The fact that the ANC is really the location of all that our freedom struggle was about, and all the kind of key moments. The Freedom Charter, for example, is in many ways the kind of constitutive document. The new political forces that are emerging, and even the DA claims the Freedom Charter as its own, and that comes out of the ANC. And Mandela is like the Freedom Charter. I mean, he's sort of, in a sense, owned by everyone. But Eddie says they don't own Krisani. Yeah, sure. That's Krisani. And Krisani isn't keeping things together. So, but I want to draw attention to the more concrete and empirical reality of the ANC in our lives, and particularly in lives of townships and poorer communities. So the ANC is very, very present at a local level, and in fact, there's very little that you can do without going through the ANC. And I mean, there's ways in which accessing local opportunities, accessing local grants, becoming local business, becoming a community liaison officer, whatever, that all goes through the ANC. And so when we look at those protests, when we look at protests from afar, what we see is, the subalterns rising. But actually, it's very much the ANC that's also involved in those protests. And quite often protests are organized, at least partly, around replacing incumbent councillors and officials with new ones from within the ANC. So in that sense, I mean, there's a kind of complex reality where, what I'm trying to point to here is that because of the intensity of the struggle over positions and access, the ANC is becoming a factor of destabilization. It's becoming fundamentally unstable within itself. But at the same time, it's a stabilizing factor. It's a reference point for so much of what's going on in our country. And the big question facing new forces that are arising, such as the United Front, is what is it going to do on this terrain? How does it engage on this terrain where the ANC is so omnipresent, is so present across all institutions? And I think that the United Front is already facing those questions. So I think that that's a really key factor of stability. I'm sure there are others, and I think that actually your questions point to a really important issue, which is to not just research the flashpoints, but to research those that didn't flash, the dog that doesn't bark. That's always difficult for sociologists, especially insurgent sociologists. Insurgent sociologists are very attracted by the dog barking, but often don't hear the unbarking dog. And I think that I want to bring that point to Maria, to your point. I mean, I think there's no ways that SWAP is withdrawing from public engagement. In fact, the public engagement now is just quite extraordinary. I mean, we've just had the biggest, SWAP breakfasts are our kind of public sociology forum, a kind of key forum where we present research to a popular audience. We just had one where we had 170 people, and that's never happened before. We had people sort of almost fainting because they were feeling so crushed in that space. So I think there's an incredible interest in the work of SWAP, and there's an incredible engagement, including education workshops, training around research and so on that we are doing. But I want to emphasize the importance of slow sociology, especially now. Because it seems to me that the characteristics of this crisis and the qualities that of fragmentation, at the same time emergence of something new, requires intensive analysis. It requires a lot of work to understand what's going on and to actually begin to think through future trajectories that emerge out of the current reality. It's not so to have a whole lot of insurgent sociology, and I'm not talking about Eddie now, although I must say you did make him sound like a vanguard party. Eddie, I don't know if you the sort of one-man sociological vanguard. But I mean, there's no good to have a whole lot of insurgent sociologists batting around if they're as confused as everyone else. I don't think it's all that clear what's emerging and where things are going and what the forces are. So I really think that the current moment on the part of sociology is not a call for frenzied activity, but actually for thinking through very carefully and trying to understand quite deeply what's going on, including why things hold together. Thanks.
I think we got to stop here, but I can't. I don't think I can go away without a last word from Jackie. Even if it's a comment or one line.
Come on, Jackie. Stand up, Jackie.
Look, I mean, I think Eddie and Carl have been terrific, but I think and also the key questions have emerged from in this discussion. I don't think things are holding together. I think that's an illusion. I think even if you were just to take the statistics Carl quoted about the extent of hunger in our society, and the fact that 25% of children under the age of 6 are showing signs of stunted growth, which says something about how we are producing a stunted generation. Just to take that one indicator tells me that things are not holding together, things are falling apart. And there is no longer a choice about what kind of future we want as an alternative to barbarism, because barbarism is already with us.
You agree with me, I was right to insist. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this ends our first session. By the powers vested in me as Deputy Vice Chancellor, I invite you to tea. And request that you are back here in 10 minutes. Thank you.